Welcome to the London Horror Movie Club. I'm horror writer Lauren Jane Barnett.
And I'm Chris Sapikowski, Lauren's older brother, and I've been watching horror movies since I was 8.
Join us as we talk about the wild, weird, and wonderful horror films set in England's eerie capital.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. This month, we have with us a writer renowned for his knowledge of British horror films, authors of books like Hitchcock's Blonde, Excerpt, Beast in the Cellars, This Amazing Witches, Bitches, and Banshees, as well as the 2010 feature film Grave Tales and the 2015 documentary Amicus Vault of Horrors. It's John Hamilton. Welcome, John.
Hey, good afternoon or good morning or whatever your time zone is. I get terrified when people say renowned for his knowledge of horror genre because I'm old. I forget everything. If I need Google to check my facts, so don't bombard me with what happened in that scene questions. I won't be able to cope.
That's the trouble is that I talk to you socially, so I know that you've forgotten more about horror films than I'll ever know. So
Okay.
it doesn't work with me.
Thank goodness.
Yeah. I wanted to start I obviously most people will probably dive into like what got you writing, what got you asking, but I wanted really to start because you've spoken with so many amazing people, like the people who ran Tygon and AIP and Hammer and the actors and directors and everything behind it. So I'm dying to know, what do you think was the best generation of British horror films? Because you'd be the one who's asked everyone that.
Oh, blimey. So I have everyone goes with their own generation, I think. So my generation is I'm not quite old enough to have seen the 1950s films in cinemas, but I saw them on television when they came on television. So I think from British horror film for me runs from 1955 to 1975. If everything else becomes very international and very homogenous, and you can't really tell the difference between if I think it was a British film and an American film or a French film during the 50s, 60s, and mid 70s, you could tell by looking at it immediately. That's a British film. That's an American film. That's an Italian film. It's kind of lost that a little bit after that. So I would say, yeah, definitely. For me, British horror is the 1960s and early 70s.
What makes it a
Well,
British film? Like what points that out to you, like in your mind?
oh my goodness, that's a great question. And I had a real problem to go back to one of the books you mentioned, Lauren. Excerpt. So the full title of Excerpt is the independent British horror film, and I gave it to the publishers, and he said you're going to have no end of trouble with that title, because what makes it British, what makes it independent, and what makes it a horror film, it depends on who you are and what your views of the world are. So, American Werewolf in London, for example, is it a British film or is it an American film shot on location, or does it matter? It's financed by Americans, it's directed by an American, it's written by an American, substantially American cast, or at least American leads. Is it an American film or is it a British film? And do you include it in a book of British films, or do you exclude it because it's an American film? You could actually go down a rabbit hole forever. And I'm sorry, I'm not really answering your question, Chris. In my head, what makes it British is there's a certain sensibility about it. There's a certain style about it. There are themes about it. They have a commonality when it comes to cast and crew. The names keep recurring. And I'm not just talking about Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, but you have people like Terence Fisher and Freddie Francis, Roy Ward Baker. These are the directors that come back and work for different studios over a period of time. So I think that there's a Britishness about it in terms of location and sensibility and themes, I think. Does that make sense? I'm not sure I answered your question properly there.
No, I think it does.
No,
Because you're right. Sometimes it's like a feeling, isn't it? You see it and you know because it's familiar. It reminds you of the other films, or it has that feel. Like you mentioned, Roy Ward Baker is obviously like he's done lots of stuff, but there's also a feel to his films, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, of course. I mean, Hammer Film is the most classic example, but because they're all they weren't all directed by Terence Fisher, but they were all shot at Bray Studios, or substantially shot at Bray Studios. So they had Bernard Robinson designing the sets, so they all had a certain feel about the look of the film. You had Jimmy Sangster wrote all the earlier ones, and then John Elder wrote, Tony Hines wrote all the later ones. So thematically, they had the same three-act structure. All Hammer films all had a beginning, the middle, and the end. They all had the young leads. They always had a savant figure, Peter Cushing. They always had a book of witchcraft, or they always had similar elements to them. And they all would look the same. And this is why the term Hammer horror exists, because it's applied to every film that was made during this period, because they tried to mimic this general look and feel of inverted commas Hammer horror. I'm not even sure Hammer had too many films that looked like Hammer horror, but I think if you look at Dance of the Vampires, the Roman Polanski one, that's archetypal Hammer horror, because he basically just took everything that looked and felt like a Hammer horror film and put it into something that wasn't a Hammer horror film. So yeah, I think there's something about the films that were made in the late 50s all the way through the 60s and early 70s that had this warm coziness about it that I recognise, because I saw them all more or less at the same time as they were being broadcast on television for the first time or appearing in cinemas for the first time. So the cozy familiarity for me is that era.
No, I love that. And out of curiosity, what are some of the horror movies in that you personally really loved when you were watching them, that you saw and got excited about?
There's a great, Kim Newman.
Yeah.
So Kim Newman said a great thing, which is stuck with me. He said there's some films that you watch, and there are some films that you have a relationship with.
That's a great
And
quote.
it's a fantastic quote, and I always credit Kim Newman with this, but what I really want to do is just say I said this, because it's such a good quote. And you've got films like Dracula, Prince of Darkness, which is not the best of the Hammer series. But I watched it on television, and I watched it with my mum, who allowed me to stay up late to watch it. And it was my first proper scary horror film with my mum. I was maybe 8 or 9 or something. And it really scared me at that age. I was really scared of it. I'm telling all my friends the next day at school, and they hadn't been allowed to stay up, but I had. So I've got this kudos of I was allowed to stay up. And you know what? It's my favorite Hammer film. It's not the best Hammer film. It's certainly not the best Christopher Lee film or Dracula film, but I have a relationship with that film, and I've watched it I 2 dozen times over the years. I've shown it to my children when they say, "Can we watch a horror film, Dad?" or "What did you write about, Dad?" I take them back to Prince of Darkness. So my 3 kids have all had the same. We watched it with Dad relationship with Prince of Darkness. So yeah, it's something I think about. When anyone says, "What's your favorite Hammer film?" I default to Prince of Darkness. It's probably not my favorite one, but it's the first one I feel a connection with, and this Kim Newman relationship with. There are better films in the 1960s and 70s to get to the crux of your question. Witchfinder General is just a stunning film. Blood and Satan's Claw is a great film. You got The Wicker Man. Everyone quotes The Wicker Man. It's not really my kind of film, to be honest, but it's a great film. I Don't Look Now, I think it's a stunning film. It was a great time for the genre. It was a great time for horror films or psychological thriller films, and that edginess was there, which I think we lost as the 70s went on, and it became a bit gritty and realistic and grim, reflecting the way the country was going. So, horror films and any cinema always reflects the time they were made. And Britain was a terrible place in the 1970s, absolutely terrible. So the films all got a bit grim and small scale and gritty. But the 60s, a swing in London, everybody was having a great time. And I think that shows in the energy of the films.
I think that's a really good, I like the answer that you gave for your favorite film there, because my favorite horror movie, as people ask me, is Nightmare on Elm Street, the first one. But it's because of the relationship. I think when I saw it, who I saw it with, the nostalgia of that time period to the point, like you said, I've showed both my kids Nightmare on Elm Street. They both thought it was very campy, very corny,
Yeah,
but they still remember it to this, remember we watched it together. That was one of their kind of their first ones. But yeah, like I think that if you sit down and start thinking about it, was Nightmare on Elm Street the best one? Probably not. I could probably now pick out things that are like, that's a better movie, or that's a better this, or I like this part of that. But you do have that nostalgia, or like you said, relationship with that film, where to
yeah,
me that'll always be the best horror movie to me.
yeah. It's your default, and I get asked quite a lot about what's your top 5 films and what's your and you want to say, if someone says what's your top 5 films, you want to say, well, Mama on the Sewers, or Lawrence of Arabia or something. Because these are classic films and great films, and I love them. And they stand the test of time and everything else. But it's not my default position. My default position is always Dracula, Prince of Darkness. Um, there's another film, Blood Beast Terror, which you might not have seen. It's Peter Cushing. It's a terrible film. It's an absolutely terrible film. But I watched it. I was doing an article on it, and I watched it again. And I was watching it at 2 in the morning with my son, who was a baby, and I was feeding him while I was watching this film. And then when he got a little bit older, I showed him this film and said, "You actually, this was actually the first film you ever saw. At the age of 3 months old, you saw this film." and and so I did an article on it, and I have this feeling about the film which I really enjoyed. But when I did the article, I broke the film down. I was very lucky. I got to interview the director and the producer and the writer and whatever else. And I broke the film down. And when you break the film down, it just doesn't hang at all. It's awful. The effects don't work, the script's not very good, the direction is stodgy. Peter Cushing's in it, so you get a polished performance from the lead, but the rest of the acting is pretty dreadful. Kim Newman again, in an article he wrote for DVD, he said even John Hamilton, the film's biggest advocate, doesn't seem to like it very much. And and that's when it hits you that actually I do like it, I really like it, but none of it hangs together or works. And your point, Chris, on Nightmare on Elm Street is very similar, because if you broke the film down to its constituent parts, it's not that good. It just isn't. Much better films have been made since, and the technology has moved on a lot, and the makeup certainly got better as the series went on, and some of it is really clunky and doesn't hang at all, but you still have this relationship with it. Doesn't mean say you can't see it for its faults, though.
Right.
Unfortunately, Blood Beast Terror is nearly all faults. There's very little good things about it. But hey, I fed my son to that at 2 in the morning.
No, I love that personal side to it as well. Out of curiosity, is that part of why you started writing about horror films? Was it just the personal connection you had with them?
Well, yeah. I mean, I've always been a writer. I think I've always wanted to write. So I've always had an old typewriter, and then I had a word processor, and I wanted to do short stories, and I wanted to write film scripts and all this sort of stuff. But most of those ideas just fell by the wayside, and I got comfortable writing about films, which I loved anyway. But I started off trying to write novels. I mean, everyone does. Everyone thinks I've got my story in me. I'm going to write a novel. And I had a typewriter from the age of 12 or 14 or whatever, and tried to bang out novels in a very amateurish way. And my wife still got a box somewhere of all the things I wrote when I was that age. I would never go back and look at any of them. The first thing I started writing properly, researching properly, I wanted to do a who's who on Nazi Germany.
Oh, wow.
This was in the 1980s, and I was a big history buff. I love history, and my brother was really into the Second World War. He's got a degree in history, so we said let's collaborate and do a book together. And in the 1980s, there's no such thing as the internet, obviously. If you wanted to know about who's who in Nazi Germany, you had to go to the library and look up the indexes of all the other books. So we had a brainwave. We just thought we'd just read every other book in the library and bring it all together into a who's who of Nazi Germany. Which is what we did. And we're reading all these books and we're writing all this stuff down, and we masses of papers, absolutely masses and masses of papers. Because there's no computers, there's no word processors, everything has to be either typed or handwritten. And we literally covered our bedroom completely in notes and scribbles of biographical details for everyone who was ever anyone in Nazi Germany. And then eventually we got overwhelmed by the research, and girls got in the way, and we listened to rock music, and he went to university, and suddenly doing a book, and then the internet arrives, and it's like, well, who needs this stuff now? It's no longer required. So sorry, I didn't answer your question at all there. Why did I get into writing about horror films? Is that what you said?
Yeah, I was just wondering. But I think writing in a broader way, it sounds like came naturally.
Yeah, so I kind of always have, and it was always the thing I was good at school was essays, and I thought I was an author, and I've got nothing but respect for people who do short. You've done short stories, and people who do short stories and get them published. I've got enormous respect for. I get enormously bored writing creatively.
Oh no.
Interesting.
Yeah, I just, and I absolutely thought I had, and I absolutely tried really hard, but I get bored and I never finish it, and I can't develop proper character arcs or plot lines or anything. And I come up with lots of ideas, and I think, yeah, this is going to be a great story, and I start, and then I get bored, and I don't do the thing you're supposed to do, plan it all first. I always just jump straight in. So I wish I could be creative, but I just don't have it in me. But I love researching. I've developed over the years a technique for researching that works for me, and I love spending time at the British Film Library or the BBC or the BBC or wherever, and actually researching stuff and following threads all the way through. I love. So I could quite happily spend the rest of my life researching for other people. The writing I'm not so good at, but I love the researching.
That kind of answered my question that I had, because in the excerpt you're looking at British independent horror movies. You were looking to write a book about the who's who of Nazis. You're picking very broad, like not broad, but like very big topics, right? Like you're not just like diving in. So the research is where the love's at for you, huh?
Very much so. And Witches, Bitches, and Banshees, I started the research on that proper about 2005. So it came on automatically from Beast in the Cellar, because there's a slight crossover in the films. When Beast in the Cellar was published in 2005, I started researching Witches, Bitches, and Banshees, and didn't get it published until 2022. So there's that 17 or 18 years worth of research. I was doing other things in between. I mean, it wasn't just sitting writing this one book. But the research story in that one is almost a 20-year journey. And I like interviewing people. I like meeting people. I like going down rabbit holes. I think for Witches, Bitches, and Banshees, it came out about 220,000 words, I think. The first draft was double that size. We had to edit a lot of it out. And when it first started, it was AIP. The book that Lauren held up earlier is just AIP UK. So we went down from 200 films to 40 or 50. In fact, more than 200. I'd already covered all the Italian stuff, like Black Sunday and Black Sabbath and all those earlier films. At which point it was too big, even for my appetite for research. It was vast. And we had to cut it down to just the British films. But even though the British films, as I said, the original draft ran to 500,000 words. I could have done volume 1 and volume 2 on that. But it's too detailed, Chris. It's too forensic. And unless you're really anal about the subject, there's too much in there. And I not so good at it, but I try to get better at it. Actually going back a level and actually taking out some of that stuff. But I get fascinated by people like Gordon Hessler or people like that, directors, and I want to write about their other films other than their AIP films. You know, I made 4 or 5 films for AIP. But I want to include other details of his life, what he did before AIP and what he did after AIP, and what was going on in his life when he was doing the AIP. And it's difficult to get, once you get that stuff into it, you have a 500,000 word book, which absolutely no one is going to publish. So you have to come out, or read for that matter. I'm not sure why anyone would read a book that size. So you have to come back and take a more helicopter view of it and actually just cut it down. So Gordon Hessler is introduced with his 2 films and his television series. It's like a 100-word introduction, and then dive straight into the films this with AIP, and then mention he went on to direct X, Y, Z without telling you what X, Y, Z is. And if you're like me, you'll be interested in the X, Y, Z element of that, and you will follow that yourself. But my original draft of it, I did the work for you and followed it through and told you what those films were, what they involved. But now it's over to you.
Does that big pile of research, do you think you'll end up using it for other books then? Will you turn it into like 4 or 5 books?
Probably not books, Lauren, probably articles. One of the books that was edited out of, which is one of the films, sorry, it's edited out of, which is Banshees and Banshees, was The Sad. Have you heard of The Sad?
I haven't.
Ooh, really interesting film. So directed by Cy Enfield, who directed Zulu, historical film. And it's got Keir Dooley in it, and Anna Massey, and John Huston. So it's got quite a big cast. And obviously it's about the sad. And it's written by Richard Matheson, who I worship Richard Matheson. Incredible Shrinking Man. He wrote that. He wrote the screenplay for Fallen House of Usher and the early Gorman Poe films. He did The Devil Rides Out, the Hammer film. He's done tons. Anyway, he wrote, sorry, you can begin to see how I spin this out to 500,000 words now, can't you? So he wrote The Sad, and it was produced, it was originally going to be filmed in the UK, but it was switched to Europe, and they filmed it in one of the studios in Berlin. And it was supposed to be IP's big movie. This was their biggest budget movie of all time. It was huge. And it was going to be a big roadshow release in the US. They were going to open it simultaneously in 1,000 cinemas or whatever. And it was going to be massive. And it just failed. It just fell on its face. But I interviewed Matheson, who wrote it. I interviewed Anna Massey, who starred in it. And I interviewed Roger Gorman, who came in for the last week because Cy Enfield, depending on the version of events that you want to believe, Cy Enfield either had a heart attack or he got pneumonia or he couldn't face directing the sex scenes and he just had a nervous break or something. But Roger Gorman then came in and directed the last week to 10 days of this. And I interviewed him about it. So I've got all this stuff about The Sad. And I originally wrote the first draft of, and it's the usual 4 or 5 or 6,000 words per film that I was doing at the time. And but it's not made in the UK. So they switched it from filming from London to Germany. And although it was supervised by a guy called Dick Hayward, who was running the London office, he didn't do it as the London office. It was did it by a co-production with a German company. So I wanted to keep it in, and it was in the first draft, but I couldn't justify it. If I'm making AIP's British films, it's not a British film. And I think you have, certainly the way I think, you have to have a set of rules and stick to those rules. You know, it has to be an internal logic to the book. And you're running through all these great films, and then suddenly there's The Sad, which I'm sure people would like, and I'm sure people would enjoy reading more about it. I hope they would. But every time I thought about it, I'd be going, it doesn't fit. It's not right. It's not a British film. So that came out. So again, a long answer to a very short question. And I don't think there'll be another book on it, but things like The Sad, I think I could do as an article. And I have the research anyway. And also the Italian films, so the earlier ones, Planet of the Vampires and Mask of the Devil, Mask of the Demon, and Black Sabbath, and those films. I could do all of those. I could end up just writing articles for AIP films the rest of my life. And may well do. Who knows?
You've done research on all these different countries. Do you have a country in your mind that is underrated for horror films?
Um, I think Italian cinema doesn't get the attention it deserves. I don't think it's necessarily underrated as such, because there's a lot of people, particularly in the States, Tim Lucas, for example, there's a lot of people that have very high opinion of Italian cinema. Um, but I don't think it gets the exposure it deserves. We tend to be obsessed with Roger Corman's AIP movies and Wes Craven's movies and Hammer movies, and we don't really give enough attention, I think, to Lucio Fulci's movies or Lamberto Bava's movies. Argento gets a lot of attention, I guess, but he's one of the exceptions. I think there's lots of interesting stuff was made in Italy during the same period I've talked about. So from the late 50s to the mid 1970s, a lot of interesting films made. Fulci's best work, I think, was slightly later than that. But it's there's something like The Beyond. It's just a terrific film. I mean, it's mad. It doesn't make any sense. But I just enjoy it enormously. It's such a cool film. Um, and yeah, I think Italian movies should be people who love Nightmare on Elm Street should watch The Beyond. It's the same level of
Okay.
madness about it. And Nightmare on Elm Street's a bonkers film. It makes no sense. If you're a psychology professor and you're sitting watching Nightmare on Elm Street, you just think this is rubbish. People don't behave that way. Situations can't develop that way. There's no internal logic to it whatsoever. It's just rubbish. And Fulci's movie's the exact same. But yeah, if you haven't seen it, go and watch The Beyond. It's great. I think anyone who enjoys Wes Craven's movies will love The Beyond. It has the same. They're not similar. I'm not saying they look alike and feel alike, but they have the same level of absurdity and madness about
No, you're
Okay.
right.
them.
That's on my list now.
Go for it. Go for it.
Yeah.
And there's some great books about it as well. Tim Lucas wrote a tremendous book about. I know he did Bava. Stephen Thrower, I think, did a tremendous book on Fulci. So yeah, there's lots of reading material available. So it's not quite underrated. I think the people who know about it rate it really highly, but I don't think enough people know about
No, you're right. The total side note, but one of the films in that was filmed in London, it's in my Deathlands book, is Woman in a Lizard Skin, and
Yes.
nobody knows that, and it's such a mind-blowingly good film.
it. Isn't it such a great film? Yeah. And there's a Living Dead at Manchester Morgue, which
Classic.
yeah, what an amazing film. And vampires I'm not into so much. The Larez movie. But I like Symptoms, which was the other Jose Larez movie. But Living Dead at Manchester Morgue, a terrific movie by George Grohl.
Yeah.
I met him once at a film festival, and he was a great guy. And it's an amazing movie. It's such a cool, weird movie. Totally not British, totally un-British. There's not like Lizard. There's nothing very British about it. It doesn't feel British. You might recognise some of the locations, but yeah, you've got an Italian crew and an Italian director and continental actors. So there's nothing really feeling British about it. But yeah, it's a great film and well worth catching up with.
I was going to say, I hope you don't mind me asking. You mentioned slightly earlier that you get bored doing fiction, and you wrote a fiction film, though. So since we're talking about films, how was it writing Grave Tales?
So Great Tales is actually my second attempt at cinema. So my first attempt, but my first professional sale was to Milton Subotsky.
Wow.
And it was a treatment I did. And he picked up the option on the treatment in 1979 or 1980, maybe 1981. Yeah, so he picked up the option, but never made it. And I assume somewhere in his estate somewhere that there's my synopsis. And I hope the new Amicus will pick it up and make it, because then I can get my money. But I never developed a screenplay out of it. I only did the treatment, and he never saw the screenplay. I started writing the screenplay, but I gave up because it didn't look like it was ever going to get to the screen. Grave Tales. it's a cheat because it's actually short stories. It's not a 90-minute movie. It's actually 5 short stories. So I wrote 4 of the 5 short stories. I'm not sure I could write a 90-minute movie. I could write a 90-minute movie. I don't think anyone would want to see it. I think it would be obvious that the writer had got bored halfway through. And was slumming it for 20 minutes, and then thought of a really good ending, and rammed it in. And I think we've all seen movies like that.
I was going to say that won't be uncommon, I'm sure.
so maybe it's more commercial than I'm giving myself credit for. I got involved in Grave Tales because I knew the director, and he wanted to make an Amicus style anthology movie, and he had Brian Clemens, who, Lauren, you probably know from Captain Kronos and the Avengers television series and those sort of films, and Jimmy Sangster. These guys, and he had them lined up, and Brian Clemens was going to write the linking story, and Jimmy Sangster was going to write the end story, and then there was a guy called Mike Murphy, I think, who was going to write one of the stories. And Don Fearney asked me to write 2 other stories that went into this anthology thing. And he storyboarded it. He already had the storyboard. So he sent me the storyboards, and all I had to do was make a script of his storyboard, which I found really easy because someone else had done the hard work of actually doing the plot. All I had to do, but I'd come up with the characters and dialogue and all this sort of stuff. So I did the 2 stories. And then Brian Clemens was still on board, but Jimmy Sangster didn't like his story and chucked it out. So then Don wanted me to do Jimmy Sangster's story, but there was no storyboard for that one. So that's the last story in the film. I don't know if you've seen the film, but the last story is called Dead Kittens. And I think it probably feels completely different from the previous stories, because the previous stories all came from one mind and one source, and then different writers adapted them. But that actually, I just dreamt it up. There was no storyboard. There was no ideas. Don wanted a story where a girl got her heart ripped out. That was my spec. He said, do me a story where the girl gets her heart ripped out. I don't know if he said that to Jimmy Sangster, but I can understand why Jimmy Sangster didn't want to progress with that. So I dreamt up everything to do with that. And then Don made various changes and stuff. So that was the last. That was me now up to 3 stories. And then Brian Clemens' story no longer worked because we changed the content of the story. So he had a linking story. He joined all the stories together. And the film was originally called The Seance, and it was going to be characters around the table telling future and seance-y type stuff. And that's how you get the intro to the story. And Brian Clemens' script no longer worked because we changed the type of stories we were using. So he dropped out. And then I had to write the linking story as well. So out of the 5 stories involved, I ended up doing 4 of the stories. But this was over a period of 18 months development. And I just came in to do it. If someone had said to me at the outset, we want 4 stories or 5 stories from you, and we need them by a week on Tuesday, I think I'd have said, I don't write that fast. It's not my thing. So it was over a period of 18 months, and it was short bursts of activity to deliver the stories. And also the stories changed quite radically. So I'd write a story and then it would change rapidly because circumstances changed and he wanted it redone. So I had to rewrite it again. But it was an interesting experience. I also did the sound on that film.
No way.
I was, yeah, absolutely. I wanted, because I'd never been involved in movies before. This was 2008 or 2009, so I never visited a film set or been involved in movies before. You know all this stuff from Tony. It's just the best thing ever. Being on a film set is just so much fun. Don't believe it when people tell you being on a film set is boring, because it just isn't. I loved every minute of it. So I said to Don, who was gearing up for the production, I'll come down and hang out. And he said, no, you won't. We're working here. And his quote to me was, do people come into your work and watch you while you're working? I was like, well, he's got a point. Some guy hanging around behind my desk watching me type No, so he said you can do it, but you have to contribute something. And we haven't got a sound guy at the moment, so would you do the sound? So I went down to Pinewood Studios to meet up with a guy called Jim Groom, who had the old sound equipment. The old spinning tape decks.
Oh yeah.
I think it's a Naga. I think it's a Naga, a tape deck machine. I'm not sure what it is, with a boom mic. It's nothing digital. This was old school tape, and he spent a couple of hours explaining to me how it all worked, and then I was on set at 6 o'clock in the morning with my headphones on and my sound mic, trying to balance the sound for 2 weeks. It nearly killed me. It's the hardest I've ever worked in my entire life. Again, Lauren, you'll know this from low budget filmmaking. It's tough. These guys work really, really hard. And we were shooting from 8 o'clock in the morning till 10 or 11 o'clock at night. And then going home from the studio, I try to get some sleep and then get up for a 2-hour drive to the studio the next morning for 2 weeks. It was, I'd never do it again. From now on, I'm just going to be the writer. But yeah, I did.
The most fun you never want to have again.
I wouldn't swap it for the world. I had an absolute blast. I had a great time, but I was physically and mentally burned out after 2 weeks. They actually shot it over in two lumps. So they shot, I think I'm right saying they did 10 days around about in April time. And then in September, they came back to film the last story, which I'd written the story, but I didn't do the sound the second time. And I think I found some excuse not to do it. I think I faked illness and had a letter from my mum saying I couldn't participate. But I don't think I could face going back. So I don't know who did the sound on the second week of shoot, the second block of shooting. It wasn't me. So any criticism you read about the quality of the sound, it all came from that second block. It's not my stuff. My stuff was fine.
So you've written all these. You said you want to stick with the writing portion. How many projects do you work on at one time as a writer?
Tons.
Yeah.
I interviewed a director once, and he told me he always has 3 projects in development. He has the one he thinks he's going to make, the one he wants to make if that one doesn't work, and the one he knows it'll probably end up being made because the first 2 never come to fruition. And that seems pretty good advice. So I currently have on my laptop now an article I'm writing. I have an article that's already been proofread and edited, but I need one final run through before I send it off to the publisher. But that's been sitting there for a month while I'm writing this other article. And I have probably draft notes for 1 or 2 other articles. And then I have a small pile of DVDs on the other corner of articles I think I'm going to write once I've finished or get bored of these other articles. So so at any point in time, I could jump from article to article and write maybe 6 articles if I wanted.
Wow.
In various stages of completion. But no, it's not as impressive as it sounds. If I was focused and professional, I would finish one article, sell it, move on, do the next one. But I tend to lose. My attention wanders, or I come up with a great idea, and I come up with a great idea for an article, and then start thinking about it in my head, and then get really excited about it, and then think, well, I'll just watch the film, and then I don't need to start the article yet. But then I watch the film, and you think, oh my god, I have to write this, and just press on and write it. So yeah, I would say I've got 3 articles right now that are pretty much done, but won't be done. I won't finish them for maybe another 2 or 3 months because I've packed them all in order to pick up other
Okay.
I'm not sure I explained that very well. But
no, it does. I don't know how your brain, like, I always find it amazing just how your brain can focus on 3 different things or 4 different things in that, as opposed to just being completely immersed. But I think it's probably a healthier way to go about it, quite frankly.
Oh, my wife hates it. She's very emotional, whereas I'm very logical. I can give you an analogy. I've got a Kindle because I lived in the Middle East for a while. You couldn't get physical books, so I started downloading everything onto the Kindle. So I have my Kindle and I have my iPad, which I'm watching you guys on now, and I'm reading a book on the Kindle and I'm reading a different book on my iPad. Although they're both linked up to the same account, but I'm reading them both differently. So the Kindle book is it's actually a Second World War book, a history book, and it's quite in depth, and it's a textbook, an academic study. So I need quiet time to read that. Whereas the book I'm reading in my Kindle is George MacDonald Fraser's autobiography. It's a very light read, so I can read that on the train with distractions around, or in a coffee bar or something. And I can separate both books at the same time without any difficulty whatsoever, because they both fulfill a very different function in my head. I'm not a psychologist, so I can't tell you exactly what function they're fulfilling. But one of them is light reading, and one of them is heavy reading, and I can separate them that way in my head and choose when I read them and concentrate on them, and they don't overlap at all. They're very different subjects, so I don't get them mixed up. And this is what drives my wife insane, because she doesn't understand how I can have 2 or 3 books on the go at the same time without losing my place in all of them. And it's because they're very different. And I don't mix them up. So the articles I'm writing, they're on very different types of films. I write an American film. The one I've got is finished and already proofread. It's a Paul Schrader film. It's an American movie, Hollywood movie. The one I'm working on right now is a British 1970s film. So they're very different subjects. If I was writing nothing but British horror films, then maybe I would get them mixed up in my head, and I would end up quoting a character who's not in that film, he's in another film. But because they're completely separate, I can do it relatively easily. It works for me.
No, it's nice.
I wouldn't necessarily recommend every writer does this.
You mentioned your wife, and I hope you don't mind me mentioning this, but at the beginning of Witches and Bitches and Banshees, you've got this really lovely dedication to her, but you mentioned that she's watched a lot of these movies with you, but she didn't necessarily enjoy all of them. And it made me really curious. Were there any movies that stood out that you watched that either she just absolutely adored and you didn't expect, or that she totally hated?
Yes, there is. So my wife's younger than me, so she didn't see these films when they first came on television. You haven't met her yet, have you?
I don't think I have. No.
Oh, okay. So she comes to these things sometimes. So I've kind of introduced her to these type of films, and she absolutely loves Dracula Has Risen from the Grave.
Oh.
She just adores this film. But this goes back to Kim Newman and his relationship movie, because she adores this film because it was the first time we ever went away together for a weekend, and we went to a film festival in Manchester, and this was the big film, and the director was there, Freddie Francis, and the star was there, Veronica Carlson, and the stuntman was there, Eddie Powell, I think, and she had never been to a horror film. She'd never been to a film festival. So Freddie Francis came on, and she's going, "Who is he again?" And I'm going, "It's Freddie Francis." And then Veronica Carlson comes on, and she goes, "And who's this?" And I'm going, "That's Veronica Carlson. She was also in blah blah blah." So she saw the interview with them, and then I introduced her because I knew Freddie Francis to Freddie, and she got chatting to them, and then she saw the film, and it was our first ever weekend away, so it was our first ever grown up date. She's got this relationship thing with Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. In terms of films she hates just not all of them. To be honest, she doesn't hate them so much. She just doesn't see the value in them that I see. She's more a child of the 80s, so she loves Chris. She loves Nightmare on Elm Street.
Okay.
This is her touch point. Is that era? So she comes in, I think. Nightmare on Elm Street is probably 1980s, wasn't it? Mid 1980s. Mm-hmm. She catches up with cinema at that point. So Toby Hooper she loves, and Wes Craven and these directors she loves, Hills Have Eyes freaks her out. She just thinks it's just the most amazing film. And she watches something like Nightmare on Elm Street or Hills of Eyes or Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and then she looks at the Hammer stuff or the Tygon stuff, and she just says, "What piece of shit? Why are you watching these movies? What do you see in these films?" And I sort of try to tell her the relationships, but she doesn't buy it.
Does she get it all into the 70s vibes, Weird Out movies? 'Cause that to me feels like it's heading in that direction.
When you say Weird Out movies, you mean the Norman Warren stuff and the Pete Walker stuff?
Yeah, the Pete Walker.
Yeah. You're right. That's very observant. I think that's probably when she gets on board with my taste is around that 1975 period. The Pete Walker psychological slasher movies is the closest she gets probably to my type of films. I've got a poster on my wall. You can't see it from And Soon the Darkness. Have you seen And Soon the Darkness?
Yeah, great film.
I don't know.
Yeah, Chris hasn't seen it. Oh,
No,
Chris,
but
you got to
he'd
check
like
it out. Yeah. So it's a psycho thriller thing about two girls in France, and they're being stalked by a killer, and the killer could be one of any number of really dodgy looking Frenchmen. And bad things happen to everyone, I think.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone comes out well in that movie.
Pretty bad.
So
I'll give that a shot too. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely put it on your list. It's actually a really good, really tight. It probably only runs for about 80 odd minutes, maybe. But it's a really tight 80 minutes worth of white knuckle ride. They used to say. I think that sums it up. It's a good film. Sorry, to finish the story. I was working in an office with this beautiful girl, and she was younger than I am, much younger than I am. And we were just chatting one day, and I was telling her about my love of films. And she goes, "Oh, she quite likes films. What kind of films?" And I said, "Well, the one I watched most recently was In Soon the Darkness." And she was like, "Oh my God, I love In Soon the Darkness." And I didn't think she'd ever heard of it because it was made in 1970. She wasn't even born in 1970. But she loved In Soon the Darkness. And I then took her to meet Robert Fust, who's the director. And we went down to his cottage and had a chat and a cup of coffee with him. And this was just the best. This is how I wooed her. I wooed her over And Soon the Darkness by saying, look at all these great stuff I know about And Soon the Darkness. And she's just completely smitten. And then a month later, I took her to this film festival, and she just thought I was a friend of the stars, and I knew all this stuff, and this is just amazing film. So she loves that And Soon the Darkness. But And Soon the Darkness plays into what you said, Lauren, about the kind of psychological thriller movies of the mid 1970s, rather than the Dracula, Frankenstein, Peter Cushing film. She doesn't really get that at all. She's cine literate enough to understand good acting and good directing and good cinematography and a good script, some of which those films have, and some of them they have in varying degrees. So she can appreciate them without necessarily liking them. You know, she can watch Dracula's Risen from the Grave and appreciate the photography in it or the story arc or whatever else without actually being into the film at all. Which Dracula's Risen from the Darkness, she loves it because it was our first date. And you're developing this as well, Tony. This is how your relationship. 20 years from now, 30 years from now, you'll be talking about your first date with you had to see some torture porn.
I saw Libra when we first met.
There you go.
For listeners who have not seen Libra, it's a short film. It is part of the Dean of the Dead Holiday Horrors anthology. Do not watch it with small children, people you deeply care about. My brother has unfortunately also now seen this, and for some reason is still letting me date Tony.
So there you go. So 20 years from now, you'll be on a podcast and people will saying, "How did you meet Tony?" And you're like, "Oh, the worst torture porn movie ever."
There you go.
I'm not letting my wife watch that before we meet Tony in person, so it'll have to be afterwards. I can't put that out there first.
No,
that's probably wise.
Yeah.
Oh, he's a lovely man. He's a lovely man. I vouch for him. He's a lovely man. And I'm sure he's not
There-
at all. I haven't seen Libra, but I'm sure he's not at all like anything in Libra.
No, he really. I cannot stress it enough. He
I-
is not.
I'm not
I've
worried
seen-
at all.
I've seen
No,
trailers
sorry,
for
John. It's the joke is
So-
the lead in Libra is in love with a corpse. So.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, okay,
So
yeah,
not
okay,
like
yeah,
that.
yeah. Be worried, Chris. Be worried.
Sorry,
I have an odd question because you mentioned you lived in the Middle East for a while, and I know nothing about the Middle East. I mean, I know where it's at and the highlights, but do they have a movie industry or do they have horror movies? I would assume that there's a folklore for every region of the world. That do they have like horror cinema there?
No, in
Okay.
I was in Middle East is a huge area. It's like
Yeah.
Europe. And I didn't really appreciate this before I go. People say the Middle East. It's like saying, do they have a horror cinema in Europe? Well, they do in
Okay.
Germany and France, but they clearly don't in Luxembourg or Norway or Sweden. So it's a bit like that. So I was in Qatar.
Okay.
Which is a small country anyway, and they have a film industry. It's all state sponsored, but they have pots of money because they've got oil and whatever. Yeah, there's some big films shot in Qatar, and they're subsidized by the Qatar government. So you see quite a lot of new Hollywood movies that feature the scenery in Qatar or Qatar as a background. So whenever anybody wants a generic Middle Eastern country, it's Qatar or Dubai or one of these big places. No, they don't have a lot of horror movies. They have folklore. They've got jinns in the desert, or genies as we call them, and you see a lot of dust swirls. They're weird looking things. They look like mini tornadoes, just a little swirl of dust, and everyone runs for cover because it's a jinn. But actually, no, it's just a natural phenomenon involving wind and sand. But it's spun out into these horror style folklore tales, but they don't really put it on cinema. They have for a small country, they have a thriving film industry.
Okay.
But you're kind of limited on what you can do and say. When I first arrived in Qatar, I arrived 2012, and I thought I'd quite like to do a movie and write a script for Qatar about a procedural police detective thing, investigating a murder, and I talked to a few people about this from the Doha Film Institute, and they said you can't do anything that's going to criticize Qatar or put Qatar in a bad light. It's that level of control you get, um, or or you'd have to film it outside of Qatar. That kind of defeats the point. I wanted to film it in Qatar. I didn't want to film it in Dubai pretending we were in Qatar. I wanted to be in Qatar. So is another one of my aborted script ideas that didn't get very far. And I over the 10 years, I would collect bits of procedure because you live in a country for 10 years. You inevitably meet policemen and meet authoritative figures or meet interesting characters that you think would be good for a character in a film. So I've got lots of notes and stuff, and Arabic terms and things like that, and photographs of locations and things, which I feel I could spin into a movie. But I could probably do it now. I'm not in Qatar, but I couldn't do it in Qatar because Qatar would not allow me to film anything that showed anyone being murdered in Qatar. The start of my story was going to be an English teacher, a woman who's murdered and just left in a skip, and it goes from there. But they wouldn't have that. They wouldn't allow that. Because that would make foreigners feel unsafe in Qatar and project the wrong kind of state image. I should emphasise I didn't speak to any authorities about whether they would or wouldn't, but it was made pretty clear to me by various friends and contacts that this wasn't a good route to go down. Try doing a social drama about how women's rights have developed in Qatar. And there's space for that, but that's not really my scene. It's not something I wanted to do. So yeah, no, there's not much of a horror industry in that part of the Middle East. So Qatar, Saudi, Dubai, the Emirates, no, they've got big Hollywood style films that go there, and they've got small local shorts and low budget films that are made there, but no genre stuff
Yeah.
at all. You
I
go
was
out
just
a little
curious.
bit.
It
Yeah,
seems
sorry.
like it's a wide open place for like people that don't know any, like their folklore and their what they think it could be something. But I also understand the concept of not putting a bad light or sending negativity there. Although London had Jack the Ripper, and I paid for a tour to walk around the city to see the spots that Jack the Ripper murdered in. So there might be tourism for both.
That's a great tour, by the way. Going back to I keep quoting Kim Newman. He's going to love this. But going back to relationships, I've taken all three of my kids at different points in their life on the Jack the Ripper walk. Because I love the walk. I think it's a great walk. And if you do it in the evenings when it's getting dark and there's not too many people around, it's actually quite scary. They get a really good atmosphere going on these walks. But no, so the parts of the Middle East are less controlled. If you go to Egypt or Morocco or whatever, you can film anything you like. And I'm sure they do. I'm sure they film lots of interesting genre style stuff. But that's not the part I was in.
Yeah.
And talking about more contemporary horror, you mentioned earlier, obviously they're trying to revive Amicus. Well, they have revived Amicus Studios.
They have, yeah.
Hammer's been trying a few different attempts to sort of reboot itself. What do you think about that? Having grown up along with them when they were at some of their bigger moments, what do you think about rebooting these industries decades later?
It's a marketing ploy, I think. It's so obviously Hammer haven't done anything or announced anything yet. But if you look at the Amicus reboot, and I wish these guys well. I have no qualms about it at all. But the only connection with Amicus really is that they're going to do an anthology story. I think their first one is going to be an anthology. But none of the other elements that made Amicus so enjoyable are there. So obviously none of the creative people are there anymore. But stylistically, they're building a studio or redeveloping a studio in Scotland somewhere where they're going to film this thing. Now Amicus always used Shepperton. They didn't have a studio like Bray. There was no home of Amicus really. And they'd pull the sets down afterwards. It wasn't like Hammer that kept a standing set afterwards. So this idea of a home base where you're going to make the Amicus style movies from was never an Amicus thing. And even Hammer now, if they make movies, they're going to make movies at Pinewood or Shepperton or somewhere. They're not going to recreate the old style. Hammer essentially bought a house and developed the house into a film studio, so all their films have the same look and feel. But you can't do that anymore. No one's going to pay for that. So if that's not there, if the theme isn't there and the style isn't there, and that homeliness isn't there, then why are you sticking with the Amicus name? Why don't you just make a film and call it something else? Why does it have to be called the Amicus thing? Well, it's because it's marketing. It's because it's a brand name. And likewise, Hammer, it's a brand name. It has a certain brand market value. So this is why they're doing it. It's an odd British thing because you don't get it in the States. I'm just thinking about this now. You've got Friday the 13th remakes and Nightmare on Elm Street remakes, and none of the remakes thought, other than the titles, they didn't think to associate themselves with the previous films by saying we shot it in the same location. They didn't go back and recreate the location and the look and feel of the original. They rebooted it completely differently, and apart from the title, it had no real connection with the earlier films. And you see that a lot with there's a lot of 1980s films have been remade in Hollywood over the last 10 years, 20 years. And none of them feel the need to go back and do this. I saw the latest Evil Dead movie, Evil Dead Rise, 6 months ago. Which is set in a city. It's set in a tower block, whereas the original was set in backwoods. So I realise that's not a remake; it's a reboot. But they didn't feel the need to associate it with the old stuff because the title itself is the brand. So having Evil Dead Rise is enough. You don't need to have the other elements. The Amicus and the Hammer and Tygon, if it ever gets revived, those themselves are the brand names. So you have to have that up front somewhere.
Mm.
The new Dr. Jekyll movies, branded everywhere as a Hammer film. Hammer had nothing to do with that. They bought it after in post production. They bought it after it was finished and stuck their name on it. So when the title comes up and it says a Hammer film, or when you see the poster and it's got Hammer written on it, it's just a marketing exercise. They're just slapping their name on it. I don't want to sound negative about these guys. I wish these guys well. Laurie Brewster, I think, is a great filmmaker, and he was at Romford actually. Did you see him at Romford?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah,
He sounds
he's
very like dedicated, if you know what I mean. Like really, really loves it.
yeah, he does. He's a real fan, a real buff. So I wish him absolutely well. But if you want my honest answer, how I feel about the Amicus and the Hammer name, just leave it. You don't need it anymore. I don't think it's important for as a viewer, it's not important to me anymore. Now, as a marketeer, it might be important to them. But what do I care how they market the film? That's their problem. As an audience, what I see on the screen has no connection whatsoever to what I saw on the screen 40 years ago. And if it did, I'd probably question why I was paying money to watch something that was, it's 40 years old. So yeah, I wish them absolute success, but I don't think they need to trade on the Hammer name or the Amicus name or any of these other names to be successful. Make a really good film. Make do something original. Make something just wild and crazy. Which is the science. It doesn't look like any film I've ever seen before. So these are creative men. Go and be really creative and don't tie yourself to someone else's creation.
That's beautifully said.
Yeah.
You can quote me on that.
Love it. Wonderful. Well, I know that we've very sweetly given us an hour of your time. I know we've taken that up really fast, but I want to make sure we leave by leaving you some time to talk about what you're doing next, where people can find this amazing book, because they probably can't just text you and say, "Hey, can we meet up and trade books?" which is what we do. So
have you read it? Have you read it yet?
Yes, I even have. I don't know if you can see, but I have like little thingies. Yeah, I've been reading it. It's great. And I've got I'm researching a book right now on plant horror films. So these are like notes from like Conga, because you've got those amazing pictures of the alternate ending.
Of course, yeah.
And then like this one is Die Monster Die. Such a fascinating and underknown film. But you've got some like fantastic little tidbits and stuff. So I've flagged them so I can come back to them for my own book.
Feel free. Well, out of curiosity, what did you think of it as someone? So I have a very biased view of these films. So I'm feeling warm about the films before I even start writing about them. But as someone who had no baggage, what do you think about a book about those films? Did you find it readable or?
Yeah, I really did. I mean, obviously, there's quite a lot of stuff in here for people who like know it really well, because you get into all of the people and stuff. But I think you did such a really great job, because you get to hear the great kind of stories behind these films. Like I've seen Conga, and I knew like it's sort of British version of King Kong, but kind of not, and it's fun and it's a bit schlocky. But then you read like one of the things that stuck out in my memory is like one of the cinematographers that his like claim to fame was that he did like I think it was you were saying it was like he did like documentary footage of an area or something in Eastman color.
Oh, yeah,
that was it.
Yeah.
That was all. And you're sort of like, oh my god, no way. So I found all of the like details so cool. It was so cool, and it made me be like, oh, I have to watch this again. It's like, did it matter? Did it like these little bits that you kind of, I don't know, even more fascinated by how the film was made, because you watch it and that's one thing, but when you realize the story behind it, you kind of want to see it again in that context. So I found it really exciting.
Good. So this is the stuff I love. I love to know that the cameraman developed Eastman color and high altitude and stuff like that.
Isn't that wild?
This is why it takes me 20 years to research a book, because you start pulling a thread, and I then spend the next week and a half researching the cameraman. And I'm not saying the cameraman's not important, because clearly he is. But for people who are watching the film, they don't care about what the cameraman had for dinner or where he went to school and stuff like this. Whereas I do, I love that stuff, and I could just spend all day just filling out biographies of everyone who's been involved in the film. So no, I'm glad you liked it. I'm glad
I
you enjoyed
loved it. It's a bit like, I don't know if other people will have this feeling, but if you do know AIP films and you love them, like, you know, I mean, everyone knows Finder General and the Fives films, but even the smaller ones, it's like getting to know an old friend better, because you see in the film and then you get this whole bigger picture and you're like, oh, I want to see it again, and it makes you kind of love it even more. It was wonderful.
Good. No, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Glad you enjoyed it.
And
I
so,
haven't.
all of you listeners, get it,
Yeah.
because it's wonderful.
So it's on Amazon. Chris, you have no excuse. It's an American book, so it's in the States. It's more difficult to get over here in the UK than the States.
Is it? Yep. I'll order it today. I'll order it today.
Don't order from Amazon. Sorry, I shouldn't say Amazon. But go to the Little Shoppy of Horrors website.
Okay.
Amazon's overpriced, but Dick Clemenson will give you a good deal if you go to his website. He's the publisher.
Sure, I can definitely do that.
I
I was going to ask you what books do you? My book collection is very small, obviously. I have pictures. I don't have books up or anything. But what I will start with that one, and then what do I go for after that one? Do I just go with both the excerpts and then kind of in your
for my book specifically?
Yeah.
So I think you're going to say I would say this. I think Witches, Bitches, and Banshees is the best thing I've ever written.
Okay.
That's my 8th book, and I think it's the book I found my voice writing. That sounds quite pretentious, but I think if I hope you can tell me if I'm wrong, Lauren, but off air. I hope if you read the book, and you know me, the two match up. So I think my writing style and me as a person match up in Witches, Bitches, and Banshees. And so it's the book I'm most happy with, and the book I will show people and say, this is my style. This is me. Excerpts I think are good books. I enjoyed writing them. But I think the next stage of evolution, my personal evolution as a writer, was Witches, Bitches, and Banshees. The first book I ever did was on Tygon, Beast in the Cellar, which is still my best-selling book, and I got terrific reviews and Rondo nominations and all of that malarkey, and that was my first book. And I think I'm not going to knock it. I think it's a great book, and the publishers did a fantastic job. I think I could write it much better now than I could 20 years ago when I first wrote it. And I think I could do excerpt better now than I did then. The only book I own the rights for is Beast in the Cellar. They reverted to me, so I have the opportunity to actually put my money where my mouth is and do a better job than I did 20 years ago. That's one of the projects that's bubbling under, is doing a reboot of Beast in the Cellar, which I'd love to do. But it's a big. I don't know. Have you seen it, Lauren? Did you ever see?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I got it at British Library because it's massive.
Yeah, it's a great, and they did a fantastic job of it. They did a great. The publishers Fab Press did an amazing job of it. But everyone asks about it. It's been out of print now for about 10 years, and everyone always asks me about it. And it goes for stupid money on eBay and Amazon. It's like £150 or something. It's just mad money. So I'd like to do a reboot of that. And I spoke to a designer at Fright Fest last year about it, and he's quite keen to get on board and redesign it too. So maybe I don't want to spend 10 years doing it though. I want to do it quicker. I've also met a lot of people since then. We'd cut the research off in 2004. It came out in 2005, and I had to draw a line in 2004 because I do my usual, spending far too much time researching. So I had a drop dead date in 2004, and since 2004 I met a lot of people and interviewed them that I couldn't include in the book because of the drop dead date. So I'd like to go back and add these people's views in. My views on some of the films have changed slightly, and certainly I have a lot more information on the films now. And also in 2005, the world of the internet, the world of DVDs and Blu-rays, was less developed than it is now. So there's a lot more information available now. I had to watch the films, and when I watched those films, I had to watch them at the BFI. I had to go and rent the original reels at the BFI and watch the films because they weren't out in video. DVD was only just kicking off in those days. There's no other way to watch the film, so I had to hire them and watch, and they had to screen them for me. That's the only way I could see them.
Now, that's pretty impressive.
Well, I was a bit annoyed really because I tried to get hold of Roman Polanski. I wrote to him in Paris and contacted a friend of a friend and whatever else, and could never get hold of him. And so the only input I had from Roman Polanski into Repulsion and Cul-de-sac, the two movies he made for Tygon, or Tensor, was his autobiography. It's okay, but it's not great. And then about 3 months later, he brought out a box set of his films where he does commentary tracks on Repulsion and Cul-de-sac. And I was like, dude, couldn't you have just brought it out a year ago? So it's stuff. There's a lot of stuff come out since that book, like Roman Polanski's views on the. I've never listened to the commentary track. It sounds terrible. But I'm sure it gives me lots of information that I could have included in the book.
There you go. Watch this space; it might come out again.
maybe.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. This has been really wonderful having you on. I'm gonna make sure I put up a title card of Little Shoppy so that people can get to the website. Is there any other stuff you want people to look out for?
I have articles come out in the Dark Side. There's I think the next issue of the Dark Side's got one of my pieces in it. I'm rubbish at promotion. I can't do promotion. I'm not very good at it. I have a Facebook page, but I keep forgetting to update it and stuff. My publishers get annoyed with me because I'm not pushing the books enough. It's like, people don't want to see my face, Dick. I don't know what else. Once you've put a poster picture of here's me with my new book posing, what do you do after that? It's not in me to. Here's another picture of you in my book, and here's a picture of this side, and here's a picture.
That's true.
I don't know what else to do. Did you meet? You met Steve Irwin, didn't you, Lauren? Yeah, he's amazing, and he endlessly manages to find new ways of promoting his books.
It's fantastic. He's got a real gift for it. Meantime, I'm like literally like it'll be like Chris and Tony being like, "Oh, you should do this," and I'm like, "Oh, okay." there's a great story. So his last book, Tales of a Teenage Monster Hunter and Witches, Bitches, Banshees, came out at the same time, and we were both nominated for Rondos for Best Book. And I woke up one morning and plugged onto the website, and it's like, oh, you've got a Rondo nomination. So the first thing I did was hey everybody, I'm not going to bombard you with emails, but I've been nominated for Rondo if you're blah blah. And about 2 months later, I'd got 28 likes or something, and I thought, that's okay. Steve Irwin obviously woke up the next morning, did the exact same thing, and he did hey, I've been nominated for a Rondo, and he posed in like a bunny rabbit onesie or something, holding his book, and he had 400 likes within the first 2 hours. So the trick, obviously, for Deathlines and for Witches, Bitches, and Banshees is get yourself a onesie, a bunny rabbit onesie, and pose is the way to do it.
Bunny onesies is the new marketing tool.
I might have to promote this recording. I might have to like get myself a bunny onesie and be like, listen to the London Horror Movie Club this month.
Do it.
If we're going down that route, yes, you should do that.
Team effort, Chris. It's a team effort.
So it'd be twice the likes. Just a carrot. Perfect.
Oh,
I think that there's something very Freudian in that. I'm not sure we should go there.
That's my brother.
I'm not going down that way.
I watch terrible films. What can I do?
Oh Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much. That's been an
Yes.
absolute riot. And I know we've kept you over the hour, but just thank you so much.
Don't
It's
worry.
been really lovely. And
No, it's
thank
been great
you.
chatting.
Hi. And thank you, of course, to all of our listeners. And I want to say goodbye from us and to John.
Thank you very much. I've had a blast. Thank you.
Thanks. See you next time.
See
If you want to share your thoughts about this episode, please head to our Facebook or YouTube pages. We're grateful to Kukurbit, who made our music. Thank you for listening, and please join us next time for the London Horror Movie Club.